Welcome, everybody, to Dead Talk Live. And don't fear, we actually do have a guest with us tonight. Daniel Farrands is joining us, but due to technical difficulties, he is joining us by audio. Daniel, thank you for being on our show. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, John. Thanks so much for having me. And I will just have to correct you. It's Farrands. Get the
Farrands,
Yep,
sorry,
Farrands. Yeah, people,
sorry.
people. You know what? I get that all the time.
No,
It's fine.
I'm so
I
sorry.
res. No, you're fine. I respond to both.
So, Daniel, you have this very interesting project coming up. Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman. You produced it, wrote it, directed it. My first question to you is, when is this thing going to be released for us, the audience, to be able to watch it?
In fact, it releases this Friday, September 3rd, which actually happens to be my birthday. So that was kind of like a nice kind of synchronicity that it
Happy
worked out that
Happy
way. Thank
birthday!
you. Thank you. Thank you. Not for that reason, but it was just kind of a nice, surprise that they
Nice
putting it on my
birthday
birthday.
present.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. So, but that all just kind of happened because that's the way things happen to work out. But yeah, it'll be available on all the major streaming platforms, VOD, and also DVD on Friday the 3rd. So I wish it was 13th, but it is the 3rd. But that being said, yeah, so that's where people can see it. I think, yeah, we also actually had a very we had a kind of like a one night sneak preview of the movie through Fathom events. That was a couple weeks ago, so it was great to be able to see it at least the one time on the big screen.
Yes,
But
yes.
it's a movie that I think can be really enjoyed at home, and um,
Well,
and it's a scary good time. I think.
I'm looking forward to it. Now, Ted Bundy, uh, in the list of famous American serial killers, I think,
Hmm.
and this is my opinion, he is the scariest of the bunch. Not because of who he targeted, not because
Hmm.
of the methods that he used to kill these women. What, in my mind, made him so damn scary was how charming, normal, and charismatic this man was. How do you feel about that?
I agree with. I would say I agree with most of what you said. I think that was what was so terrifying was that he kind of blended in. He could just he was one of us, so to speak. Just looked like a normal guy. I think that some people now kind of criticize people who try to glamorize Bundy or to cast good looking men in the role, because a lot of people are kind of this backlash again, and well, he wasn't really that good looking in real life, and I can't believe these women would have fallen for him. I
Mm-hmm.
think what people miss the point, though, is that he just looked average. He
Normal.
looked accessible. He looked like somebody who, and again, like the way he knew how to manipulate, by, of course, these have become like horror movie tropes now. Like we've seen it in like Silence of the Lambs and so
Mm-hmm.
many other movies where the killer puts on a cast, or
Yeah.
he's, walking around with crutches, trying to kind of prey on the sympathy of the woman or the victim that he's targeting. And in the case of Bundy, it was all women. Um, but yeah, that's what was so scary about him, is that he was using his ability to manipulate, um, to prey on the sensitivity and the kindness,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, of these victims that were just honestly minding their business and trying to be nice to a stranger.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it cost them their lives. And I think that's what it is so frightening and insidious about Ted Bundy. And I think it's why we still are so interested in him. I think we're endlessly fascinated by evil, but I think Bundy personified evil, especially in the 1970s. I don't know how old you are, but I was a child back
Yeah.
then, and I do remember stories on the nightly news, especially when his trial was so sensational. And the Bundy barbecues that people were having the day that he was executed,
Yeah.
and it was all just very disturbing. And it was kind of a scary time to be a kid,
It is.
you
It
know.
is.
So yeah, so those are the yeah. I do agree with you though. He used his affability and his approachability to you know to murder and
Yeah.
to
To let his
lure these
way
women.
in to, yeah,
Absolutely.
into these
It was like the
women.
web that he would weave to try to ingratiate himself, and again, just preying on the good nature of these girls. That's what was so scary about it.
Exactly. And we all know that he targeted college aged women
Right.
primarily. Now, when
Yep.
you were writing this, how much of a deep dive into the research beyond the numerous documentaries that are available for everybody to watch. Did you try to go any other different route and try to get access to research information that was is not easily accessible to everybody else? Uh,
You
how
know, I
how deep did
yeah.
you dive into the research?
I mean, all of it is like, no matter what, it's like too deep, you know, like the minute you kind of go down that rabbit hole, you sort of get swallowed up by it. And it's really disturbing, you know, like I remember many nights, you know, working late on this and just, you know, every creak of the house, you know, I kind of jump. I mean, what people, few people think probably, unless you really know me, I'm kind of like the world's biggest chicken, you know, I'm like afraid of everything. So, um, people were like, well, you make these terrifying movies and these disturbing subjects. And I said, yeah, because all of that's the shit that keeps me up at night. You know,
Exactly.
it's the stuff that makes me afraid to sometimes, you know, face the world. I think we're all kind of like collectively in a place where we're all like kind of living in fear right now of,
Mm-hmm.
against an invisible enemy in a weird way. Like Bundy was that, you know, he
Mm-hmm.
was the invisible terror. You know, now, you know, if somebody wants to murder you, they'll just pull a machine gun out in a parking lot and just shoot everybody,
Mm-hmm.
or go into a high school. And, you know, like the things that we've seen in our society since the Ted Bundys of the world have gone into a place that's almost unthinkable in the
Mm-hmm.
way that it's just so brazen and open. And there's nothing hidden about the enemy. They're right in your face
No,
and they're going to kill you, you know? And I just feel like that's like Ted Bundy was almost like a warning of what's to come.
yeah.
And I think that that's kind of what struck me about all of it. And also, but in terms going back to your question about the research, yeah, I absolutely visited, you know, some of the really well done documentaries, including the one that Joe Berlinger made for Netflix a couple years
I
ago
saw that one.
on the Ted Bundy tapes, where
Mm-hmm.
you really got to hear, you know, the kind of psychology, the psychosis of Ted Bundy, and the malignant narcissism of this man, you know, kind of all put on these tapes. And you know, so there were elements from those. There was a great book that was written by best-selling, you know, crime author. This is back in the day, from the '80s, I believe. This book was written, called "The Stranger Beside Me." Anne
Mm-hmm.
Rule. Anne Rule, weirdly enough, she knew Ted Bundy. She worked with him
Mm.
when they were both working at a, believe it or not, a suicide prevention hotline.
Wow.
The fact that this monster would counsel people. And you know, interestingly, some of the things that I got out of her book was that she believes that in retrospect. Now, that's the other thing about Anne Rule, was that she's like, you know, I would have trusted him with my children.
Jeez.
And she said that, you know, he was so affable and kind of always concerned. She's like, he used to walk me to my car at night to make sure I got there safely.
Wow.
The same man who was approaching women walking to their cars at night and doing these horrific things to them, like, you know, there was a trigger, or there was a like a switch in him. And I think that he had a specific type of victim that he targeted. And there's a whole bunch of different theories as to why that was, including that there was a woman who had jilted him when he was in college, and the victims bore some resemblance to this woman. I don't know if that's completely true,
Yeah.
but it's a theory. But yeah, so I think the thing with Ted Bundy is that there's so many facets to this bizarre story and this bizarre man, that it's almost like each movie or each documentary takes a different point of view on it. You
Yeah.
know, like the Berlinger, he made obviously the movie that was, you know, pretty well received a couple years ago, that accompanied the Bundy tapes documentary, which
Mm-hmm.
was called Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile. It's like the longest title ever. The one with Zac Efron. That's easier way to say it. But
Yeah.
you know, his point of view on it was, you know, was Ted Bundy insane, or was he this kind of, like, he would snap in and out of these personalities? And my thought on it was he was absolutely insane, and he was, you know, one of, like you were saying at the beginning of the show, like just one of the most terrifying
Yeah.
um, figures. And but I felt like that movie sort of played it a little bit middle of the road. And I'm not criticizing the movie. I think there was a lot about that was very well done, and I think Zac Efron played a really effective Ted Bundy. But you know, for me, the way that I approached this movie, the one that I made, and that's releasing this week, is that Bundy was just this monster. He was this American boogeyman, if you will, this
Exa-
phantom that was stalking and murdering people for almost, you know, no reason.
Mm-mm.
And I think the lack of humanity is really what I focused on. And the other part of the story is really that I felt like had never really been addressed in some of these other films was just the difficulty faced by law enforcement and what it was like in those days to track a killer like him who was clever, who did know how to dodge the police, who was using the new highway interstate system to kind of throw them off his trail.
And picked
And
victims at random.
yeah, and them trying to find a pattern. And there was, there's a line in the movie where Kathleen McChesney, who the movie is based on, and in some ways loosely based on her, she was this young rookie police detective out of the Seattle Sheriff's Department. She's played by Holland Roden in our film. She does a great job. But she was just this young, trying to make her way in a very male dominated profession
Yeah.
at the time, and trying to just put on this task force. And in fact, the upper echelon in the department was like, well, we just brought her in to soften up the witnesses. They didn't believe in her abilities.
Mm-hmm.
It was the sexism machine
Oh,
counter.
yeah.
So I wanted the movie to be about that. It's a woman trying to make her way in a very male dominated profession. And yet she kind of understood the psychology of what was going on here. She really looked at the patterns and the victims, and kind of really tried to delve into the thought process of this killer in order to try to track him. And then just the obstacles, like there was no computer in the entire police department. They had one for the payroll department.
Yeah.
That was all they had.
Yeah.
So in order to track this VW that this Beetle that he was driving around in, they knew that much after he committed these murders at Lake Sammamish. It was like 40,000 Beetles. It was a very popular car back in those days. And by one on little index cards, they had to go through these, the specifics, the owners of these cars. There was no database. There was
No DNA.
DNA, no tracking of any kind of, common personality traits and things that just didn't exist yet. So
What
it was,
Oops, sorry.
yeah. No, I was going to say this movie kind of tracks the origins of modern detective work in a way.
What fascinates me in watching these true crime documentaries is psychopathy, basically psychopaths. And to really, people think and a lot of time mix up sociopaths with psychopaths. They're very,
Right.
very similar, but there is a little bit of a slight difference. Ted Bundy was your classic psychopath slash narcissist. Like
Yes.
the point you made when he would be working at the suicide prevention line, I think he did that because he felt the power. Yeah,
Yes.
a person would
Right.
call vulnerable on the verge of wanting to commit suicide, and just that power that he would probably feed off of to save her life would give him the satisfaction he wanted, and he could very easily track that person down and then go kill them without a second thought.
If he wanted to, certainly. And, I think part of what he had a God complex. He wanted to play God.
Yeah.
One of the things that I gleaned from one of the documentaries, I think it was the Ted Bundy tapes, where he says, in that moment where you feel the last bit of breath leaving her lungs, in that moment, and she's staring into my eyes, I knew I was God.
Yeah.
Just so chilling. So in the movie, there's a kind of like an inner kind of monologue going on in Bundy's head, played, I think, very, very brilliantly by Chad Michael Murray, who I think is going to surprise a lot of people in this film, just how terrifying he is and creepy. But we kind of used like these inner thoughts, Bundy's having as he's driving around the highways looking for his victims. And all of those thoughts came from the actual recorded, statements of Ted Bundy, whether they were police statements or the tapes or what have you. I just drew upon every various kind of source that I could come up with to find the things that he said that gave us some insight into his mentality, his psychology, psychopathy, as you call it. Yes, yeah. I mean, it was that kind of research that really, you feel like you're tapping into something really, really dark and almost taboo. And I didn't want the movie to have that kind of, I need to go take a shower feel after we watch it. But I did want to make sure that Bundy was never presented or portrayed in a sympathetic light, or as somebody that we should hold up as some kind of like anti-hero. I just looked at him as being a despicable human being. And I think,
Exactly.
Chad and I had a lot of conversations about that, and we both really felt we're on the same page, and like we just have to we pulled back on some of the dialogue. We pulled back on some of the humanity. There was a scene where he was early on in the movie. He was on the phone with his girlfriend and acting like a dutiful father. And I know Chad really liked that scene, but I said, you know what? It humanizes him too much.
Yeah.
And I think that it makes the movie stronger when we don't. I just didn't want to make a movie about the duality of Ted Bundy. I've
No.
seen that, and
No.
I wanted to focus on the monstrosity of him.
The
I keep
du-
saying that, but it's
in
it's really
my
what
in my opinion, the
mine.
duality, the nice part of him, was a facade, was an act.
Absolutely was, no doubt about it. But I think he understood how to compartmentalize it. He knew how to put it in a place where he could be that when he needed to be. He'd pull it out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he ever felt any real feelings of affection or love. I think that's one of the questions that Berlinger's film, the Shockingly Evil movie, it's like, could this man have felt real love? And I don't think so.
No.
I think it was always just a facade.
Yeah, and that's why psychopathy fascinates me, because it's the part of the
Mm,
brain that just is doesn't work. The part of the brain that
right.
makes us feel empathy, sympathy, remorse.
Hmm.
It's not like these people, and I'm not defending Ted Bundy here. It's not like they do it on purpose. They're born that. I believe they're born that way. I don't think it's something that develops because of their social environment growing up. My opinion is that psychopaths are born, and you can call it a mental disability, whatever you want to call it. It's just that part
Hmm.
of the brain that allows the rest of us to feel sympathy, remorse, empathy is turned off in their
Right.
brains. Now, going
Hmm.
to the casting of this
Yeah.
movie, how hard was it to find your Ted Bundy in Chad? How long did it take you? How difficult was it?
I mean, it was a little bit of a process, but remember, we were attempting to make this movie at the height of the pandemic, when it was, basically we were on fire with this pandemic last summer, in the summer of 2020, when we were all kind of like living in our bubbles, and we're all quarantined, and nobody was really leaving their house at that time. And yet, the producers behind this, like, we think that we can do it. And fortunately, while I was writing it, we had found the locations, and I kind of almost like wrote the script around the locations, which fortunately was a very isolated, kind of almost like abandoned college campus out in Pomona, California.
Okay.
And so fortunately, we already had this location that we knew was already kind of its own kind of quarantine bubble, the way
Mm-hmm.
that it just sort of was there. And it wasn't like we'd have to interact very much at all with the outside world if we shot the movie there. So it was a bit of a safe bet there. But in terms of like casting, it was all done like this, like Zoom,
Yeah.
and that's how I met Chad initially. And a couple of other actors were suggested. It was just that when I met him, and he read the script very quickly, and he understood where I was going with this, it just made a lot of sense. And the other thing that struck me was that he had played this really interesting kind of disturbed character on oh my gosh, Riverdale,
Okay. Yeah.
playing this kind of like bizarre cult leader. And the way he just kind of turned, you could see kind of like a shift in his mindset. And I was like, that's kind of how Ted Bundy was.
Mm-hmm.
He knew how to like shift.
Yeah.
Like his mind was always kind of in gear, and he was always like thinking about the next thing he was going to do to manipulate this person or this situation. And the fact that he did that so convincingly, I was like, and the fact that he understood the script just made a lot of sense.
Okay. Okay. Now you have.
And people are, there's some criticism like, oh, you have to keep casting these good looking men in these roles. And I'm like, you know what? That was never the
Mm,
point. And, back in the day, Ted Bundy, I mean, maybe the standards of male beauty have shifted over the past, 30 years, but Ted Bundy, I thought he was considered a pretty good looking dude back in his
he
day.
was.
Women
Yeah.
there were fan clubs. They wrote letters to him when he was on trial, and he made a big spectacle of it because he,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, he loved the attention. That's the narcissism.
He,
But you know, probably there are some unbecoming pictures of Ted Bundy, but I think overall, I think that, I'm not just saying women, but I think the press, and I think you know
they made him into a
the
superstar.
common, yeah, but I think the common perception at that time was like, how could this good looking, smart guy be this monster? You know, I
Mm-hmm.
think that was always like the question about him. So it wasn't like I made a conscious choice, like, oh, we need this really good looking guy. You know, I was like just looking for the best actor
Yeah.
who was willing to inhabit such a dark character and not try to create, you know, some level of sympathy. I mean, a lot of actors, they're like, yeah, but I want to show the other side, you know, and Chad thankfully was not interested. He's like, I just, let's go dark. Let's go to the devil with this because that's who this guy was. He was a fucking deranged monster.
Absolutely.
And so that's where we both kind of like mind melded on that.
Good. I'm glad that makes it even more tempting to me to watch it as soon as it comes out. Now, you have done a lot of documentaries in your
Mm-hmm.
career. This movie is not a documentary. I just want to make that clear to everybody. But
Right.
did you use any, when you were directing it, did you use any elements that you would use while you were shooting a documentary for Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman? Or did you just completely leave that aspect out? Because this is a true story, unlike a
Mm-hmm.
lot of other movies that say based on true events and then it's very watered down. This is a
Sure.
very true, real story. A lot of people died. This man was very dangerous. Did you
Mm-hmm.
approach this at all from any kind of documentary standpoint?
I mean, sure, I did. You know, I mean, we had very limited time and very limited, you know, resources to make this movie, and then on top of that, throw in the fact that it was the first, you know, COVID era independent film to go into production. So we had all kinds of just, you know, challenges. You know, we're having to wear masks and learning how to work in zones, and you know, COVID testing for the entire casting crew, which is not cheap.
No.
You know, multiple times a week, just to keep everybody safe. That was our like before anything else. It was we need to keep everybody safe. And fortunately, we you know, and they were watching us like hawks. You know, the guilds and the unions and stuff to see how it would work. We were kind of like guinea pigs in a sense on this film. But that being said, yeah, so I kind of had to rely on my documentarian skill set, I guess you would call it, because
Mm-hmm.
like in a documentary, so much stuff happens on the fly, and I just wanted to be able to capture some of that. We're still doing your traditional film setups, and it's not trying to be a documentary, but I certainly pulled from some of the resources, some of the old news clippings, crime scene photographs that you'll see that were actual crime scene photos. You know, not the incredibly gory things, but um, just the faces of the victims. That was another thing that was incredibly important to me, is just to show them, to say their names, to be almost an advocate for those girls who lost their lives so
Yeah.
horribly and unfairly. Um, you know, Holland Roden's character really is kind of their voice, and
Yeah.
she's the one that keeps reminding, like, these are the people that we need to be concerned about. They're the ones that I'm doing this for. She's kind of fighting for them.
Mm-hmm.
She gives a voice to the voiceless, if you will. And so that was an important element for me. But yes, so in a way, the documentary filmmaker side of me is always there, because when you have to do things quickly, you have to think on your toes.
Okay. Now, your name is attached to some very big franchises.
Mm-hmm.
Halloween, the Amityville
Mm-hmm.
franchise. Let's just talk
Mm-hmm.
a little bit about the Amityville murders.
Mm-hmm.
I loved it. I really loved that movie. And
Oh,
I'm not
thanks.
going to say that for a lot of the Amityville reboots,
Yeah.
remakes that have come along the
Right.
way.
Or the haunted lamps,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
haunted dollhouses, and all the things that have come around the pike. And then now they do like the craziest ones. There's like Amityville Shark Attack and
yeah. I'm like, come
Amityville Cop. I
on.
don't even
Yeah.
know. It's just,
But the
I think,
Amityville
yeah.
murders touches on something that surprisingly no prior movie has, and that's the actual DeFeo family and what
Mm-hmm.
they went through, all the way through what Ronnie DeFeo did at night when he
Mm-hmm.
murdered his family. What inspired you to tell the DeFeo story, not the Lutz story?
Yeah, you know, I had my talk about the beginning. My documentary work kind of always seems to kind of, pardon the expression, but bleed over. But I had my very first documentary was a retrospective on the Amityville case
Yeah.
back in 2000, so 21 years ago almost. That was my very first attempt at ever making a documentary. And in the process of making that, it was a 2 hour History's Mystery special for the History Channel. It aired on Halloween night of 2000. So, but in the process of making that, I connected with and interviewed pretty much everybody who was alive at the time, and many of those people have passed on now,
Yeah.
who had anything to do with the story, including the Lutzes, including uh, Dr. Hans Holzer, who had investigated the house, Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are
Mm.
now like household names, but weren't at that time.
Yeah.
Just, a whole kind of like a who's who list of everybody who had ever had any
Actually, the
involvement.
Amityville scenario is really what put Ed and Lorraine on the map.
Oh, without a doubt,
Yeah.
without a doubt. But that being said, so out of that project grew this personal connection, friendship, nephew uncle kind of relationship with the now late George Lutz, who just became a friend, like a confidant of mine, and I him. And it was not always about business. It was more of it was a friendship,
Yeah.
and a friendship to the extent that when he passed away in 2006, I did the eulogy at his service.
Wow.
So there was a personal connection to the material. Um, but a few years ago, I was approached by a company that was, independently financing films, and they wanted to do something with a haunted house.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I said, listen, and the rights to Amityville were kind of tied up with my old friends at Dimension Films at the time. That's a whole other
Well, I
story.
can
But
imagine. In fact,
oh my
I
goodness,
actually
yeah, we have
considered
to.
asking you, but I'm like, that would be a whole one
Yeah,
hour show in
yeah, I
itself.
was going to say that's a whole
Yeah,
other show.
yeah,
We'll do that
yeah.
another time. But that being said, but I said in this meeting I said what hasn't really been told, as you just pointed out, was the story of the DeFeos and what may have happened. Nobody will ever truly
Mm-hmm.
know the way that played out that night. But I came at that story from like again, almost like with Bundy, like there's three different things going on. Butch DeFeo was this, hardened, the spoiled kid who was also severely addicted to drugs, and he lost his fucking mind
Mm-hmm.
and did what he did. The second part was, there was mafia connections within the family, and that maybe that had some kind of, influence over the events that followed that night. Not saying that they did it, but that there might have been some connection
Yeah.
with the money and then, that kind of underworld connection the family had. And then the third is that, maybe the house was haunted.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some diabolical influence got to him, or that maybe through his use of these like psychedelic drugs that he opened a pathway
Mm-hmm.
to something, and maybe there is something about the history of the land and the native burials, and there's so much lore behind it. And I just thought, let's bring all of that stuff together and create kind of a new version of this. I mean, the story was a little touched on very, very, very loosely in Amityville 2, The Possession, back in
Yeah.
the early 80s, but they didn't use the DeFeo
No.
the name, and they really took, a lot of liberties. We took some because, there's no real definitive answer to how that all happened, as I mentioned. But yeah, that was kind of the genesis of that was that there was an interest in doing something along these lines. And I suggested this story, and they understood it, and they appreciated that I had a vision for it. And so we went off and we made it. We made it very, very quickly. I think I wrote it in a month. And, by that, maybe it was April when I pitched it. And I think by July we were shooting that movie.
Wow, that is pretty quickly in
It
entertainment
all happened very
standards.
fast.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
Now,
again, like Ted Bundy, it was a small budget, and we made it, and I think it was like 13 days.
wow.
Yeah,
Now Ronnie DeFeo did a documentary from prison. Ronnie DeFeo passed away, I believe.
he
Yeah,
did.
yeah,
Yeah, earlier this
yeah.
year.
He
Yeah.
passed away several years ago. He did a documentary speaking from prison, and
Hmm.
he was really kind of open and honest. Did you watch that at
You
all?
know what? The words open and honest don't compute in my mind when you talk about Ronnie DeFeo. He was such a product of the system at that point. He is again. I mean, maybe sociopath defines him.
Mm-hmm.
He had no remorse for what he did. He never took responsibility for what he did. And he was always pointing the finger at somebody else.
Yeah.
And the story changed so many times. One day it was his mother. One day it was the mob. The other day it was his best friend. The next day it was his sister. It's just the story never. I mean, they talk about how the Lutz's story fell apart,
Yeah.
claiming it was haunted. Like, talk about the story that falls apart. It was his. So anything that ever came out of his mouth, take it with a grain of salt.
Oh, yeah.
I just couldn't believe it. So when you say open and honest, nothing
Well,
ever that
that
he ever
just
said
goes
was
to
open and
show
honest.
you how manipulative and how good of a liar he is. You
For
know
sure.
that he
Yes.
can
Maybe
give.
there's a weird Ted Bundy parallel there. I'd never thought about that. But yeah, I mean, just yeah, that manipulation and I think he used the media to his whatever he felt would be his benefit. He was always just looking for a way that he would get paroled. And I think by never admitting to the murders, he always
No,
thought, well, maybe there's my way out. If I don't admit to it, then maybe one day I'll get out of
and
here.
that's completely the opposite end of the right thinking.
For sure.
Now, Long Island, where Amityville is, it is. It's
Hmm.
no secret. It's full of ancient Indian burial grounds. There's no doubt about that.
No doubt.
But why do you think the Amityville story? Okay, I get it. Back then, a son murders his whole family. It's going to be huge news. It's going to be nationwide news. But to this day, 2021, that
Mm,
story is still
I know.
being revitalized, retold, added
Yeah.
to. What has
Yeah.
kept the Amityville lore alive for 40 plus years?
My simple answer is that it's never really been solved from the DeFeo murders where, six people were brutally murdered in their beds, all face down, all in the same position, all fired at almost like a shot at point blank range
Yeah,
by a high powered hunting rifle in the middle of the night in this small bedroom community. And nobody hears the gunshots,
yeah,
including any of the victims that even attempted to get out of bed. Everybody had, this like you go online and there's forums and there's these groups dedicated to this, and they all same, everybody claims to know something.
no.
But the bottom line is the evidence bore out that he was the only killer.
And
His sister didn't do it,
no.
as he might have claimed. They all slept through it. And how did that happen? And then add on to that this family, this kind of blended family that moves in a year later, and they stay for 28 days, claiming all of these, horrific things. I think, listen, you look at the book and you look at the movies and all that, and it all gets, like a snowball. It all kind of gets, the story grows with each telling.
Yeah,
If you look at just the media of it all. But in terms of the family themselves and my knowledge and my personal connection to them, their story didn't change.
no,
They and they would openly tell you it wasn't true. There was no blood coming out of the walls when they fled in the middle of the night. It wasn't as dramatic as the movie made it out to be. Certainly not the remake,
yeah.
but there was something that terrified them enough to give up a house that they had invested the life savings in. They gave that house back to the bank. They didn't want to be responsible for passing it on to another family, so they lost what money they had invested in it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some accusation that they didn't have any money to pay the mortgage and they wanted to get out of this thing. That's not true. I mean,
No.
I just even saw the family's bank statements from the time, and they had plenty of cash on hand. It wasn't like they couldn't afford the mortgage. Um, but
Oh, I believe
you just have to
something
you just
happened. And well, first of all, I'm a believer of the
yeah,
paranormal. Something
right.
happened for them to abandon that house in the middle of the
Mm-hmm.
night and never go back
Yep.
to pick up their stuff.
Right. And they just let it all, it either got sold at auction or was all given away. And they wouldn't go back. Laura DiDio was an interesting person. She was a young new intern at the local news station. And she's the one that kind of convinced them to go public with it. It had already kind of hit the local newspapers, but she was the one that brought the Warrens into the case. And organized this kind of seance that was ended up being televised, but the Lutzes wouldn't go anywhere near it. They wouldn't go into the house.
No.
In fact, she told me that when they went to get the keys, George Lutz like I'll meet you at the pizza place up the road because I'm not going anywhere near that house.
Yeah.
And even when I first met him, when I went off to do the History Channel shows back in 2000, he said, if you go into that house, I'll never have anything else to do with it.
Wow. Now here's a.
So
Now,
yeah,
I have a
I don't
question.
know. Like people say it's not haunted now, but whatever happened, I think really affected that family.
The haunting could not have been. I mean, just because it's not there now, it disappeared with them. For me, that
Could have
doesn't
been.
say that it's never been haunted. That it wasn't
Right.
haunted with them.
That's right.
For
Right.
me, that
That's
is
right.
no proof whatsoever
I
that it
agree.
was not haunted. Now, I've got a question for you. You knew the Lutz
Sure.
family.
Hmm.
Is it true that when they purchased the home, they kept the DeFeo furniture, including the bed frames and stuff?
Some of that stuff, like the washer and dryer, there were several, I think, well, three and three and washers and dryers. There's some of the appliances I think that went with the house. Yeah, some of the we're not talking about mattresses or
No, no.
box springs or anything. Like there were the parents' bedroom was not theirs. I think one of the children's beds, just the frame,
Okay.
like the bed frame itself, but not like actual pieces of furniture where like this is the mattress that the dead
No,
girl slept in.
no,
I think that
no.
all got, again, like if you go online, you'll see that like, oh, they even slept in the beds where this, I mean, that's
No, no.
ridiculous.
That's something the police would
And
take
of course, all of that
anyways.
stuff would have been taken by the police
Exactly.
as evidence, and those mattresses, I'm sure, were torn to shreds just to get the trajectory of the bullets that went through them. So, yeah, but I think maybe now you look back on it, maybe it was macabre that they even had like the bed frames.
Yeah.
But this was just stuff being stored in the cellar, from what I understood. It was just like, oh, any of this stuff, just, it's yours. Or, for a couple $100, you can
Yeah.
have this, and this. It wasn't, and you have to remember, like, they weren't particularly religious family. They weren't superstitious. The realtor, her name was Edith Evans. She showed them the house. I think they had told it to me. It was like we had looked at like 50 houses at the time. We were just looking for something that we could move into. Kathy and George were married. She had 3 kids from a previous marriage, and they were looking to kind of begin their own life together
Mm-hmm.
as family. And Mrs. Evans took them to the house on Ocean Avenue, and she let them walk through it. And like you do when you see any house, imagine the possibilities here.
Well, it's a
And
beautiful house.
beautiful home. And I think, when they saw it, they were like, wow, this is something. She said to them, I'm going to show you how the other half of Amityville is.
hmm
That's how she kind of hooked them. And then when they finished touring the house, she said, well, you need to know that this is the house where a year ago this tragedy happened. And what I was told is they all, as a family, sat around, they talked about it, they explained to the kids, and none of them had any misgivings. They were kind of like, well, we can bring our own family to this and our own, it's a do-over.
Yeah.
And it's not like I think in the movie they say houses don't have memories.
Yeah.
Of course they
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that was the beginning of it all. And I don't think that, they certainly didn't go in there with any plan to create a haunted house
No.
hoax or
No.
and I think DeFeo in one of these interviews like, oh, I knew them, I used to drive them around, I'm like, come on.
I think the Lutz family got really mistreated by the media, and once something like that starts to spiral out of control,
Right,
you have
right.
you have no control. It's out of your
Yep,
hands, and the
yep.
media is going to take it whichever way they want to take it.
Well, and especially people had an appetite at that point. It was like we just come out of, it was like, the 70s, early mid
The
70s were all
Exorcist.
it was The Exorcist, it was The Omen, and then Amity. Like it was like the evil trilogy of terror. That was,
Exactly.
that you wanted to believe in all. It was like the devil was everywhere back then, and I think this just fed into that already existing fascination with the devil
Yeah.
and I think what made Amityville so, I don't know, popular was that it was just your average house. It had this dark history associated with it, but this was, it wasn't like the creepy haunted house on the hill. This was just an average house in a lovely neighborhood that had a whole lot of things going for it. And yet, here's this average American family that moves into it, and holy shit,
Everything
we can't
falls
stay
apart.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, just it speaks to a lot of things.
Now.
Stephen King wrote about it,
Yeah.
where he was saying that, and he was really talking more about the movie, but how it was really kind of a metaphor for the fracturing of the American dream, and that this house represented that, and all of the things that were collapsing around, American culture at that time, the norms. So, I
That's
mean, you can look at it
interesting.
from that perspective as well.
That's
But yeah, I think
interesting.
it was just one of those things that hit the zeitgeist at the right time. For the family, maybe not so much. But one thing they always told me was, we made the decision to go public. We made the decision to authorize the book. We made the decision to let them make a movie of it. So we can't blame them completely. Like
hmm
they didn't look at themselves as like, well, we're just victims of the media. Like, yeah, I mean, I think that they didn't anticipate what
No.
was coming, the kind of like tidal wave that followed them.
But they took
Um,
ownership of their part.
they did, yeah, and I think George Lutz spent the last couple years of his life, kind of lecturing on the college circuit, just talking to people about his experience, and always saying, at the top, he'd do a slideshow, and he would say, I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm just here to tell you my testimony. This is my experience. This is what happened. and you can believe or not believe. I'm not here to try to change your mind.
Yeah.
So he really, and but it was interesting how so many people would approach him after his lectures about stories, things that had happened in their homes
Mm-hmm.
during their childhoods. And I think he felt, I don't know, I think there's something to be said by people who experience a similar, a trauma or an unexplained something like that. I think people bond over things like
Yeah.
that. And
It's an
maybe there is a little,
unusual experience, and if it's
yeah,
shared by someone, it's going to bring people together. It's a shared
right.
experience that's not very common. Now, the time that we
Mm-hmm.
have left, I want to
Yeah.
talk about another huge franchise that you've been a part
Mhm.
of, and that's, of course, the Halloween franchise.
Oh
You
gosh, of course.
you wrote Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers.
Yep.
Uh, Great movie again. It was part, before it splintered into H2O, and then it started going different directions. It was
All these different alternate timelines that
exactly
exist, right? Right.
The Curse of Michael Myers, which I believe is Halloween number five,
Six.
six,
Nope, it's six actually.
six.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
How did you get involved with that, first of all?
Gosh, I mean, it's such a long story, but I'll try to summarize it as quickly as I can. But I was just a fan. I was like a huge Halloween fan. I grew up loving. It wasn't really so much a series at that point. It was like there was one and two, and I made a declaration after I saw, weirdly enough, after I saw Halloween 5, and I said to the friends that I saw the film with that I was going to write Halloween 6. How I was going to do that, I had no idea. I didn't know the producers. I had no produced film credits at that point. So I really just kind of figured out a way to approach Mustafa Akkad, God rest his soul,
Mm-hmm.
who was the executive producer and the kind of the elder statesman, the granddaddy of Halloween at that point. He kind of held the rights to the whole series, and I found an address for his production company. I wrote a letter. One of the people at his company, named man by the name of Ramsey Thomas, he was one of the producers of Halloween 5, read the letter and he said, "Great, we're looking for writers for the next movie. Send me a sample." So I wrote. I had a bunch of scripts I'd written, never sold, not Halloween scripts, just horror original things that
Mm-hmm.
I'd written. I picked what I thought was the best of the bunch and sent it off to Ramsey, thinking I'd never hear anything. And he called me a couple weeks later saying, "Mustafa would like to meet you because we liked your script." And holy shit, I was
Yeah.
19 years old at that time.
Wow.
I was 19. And so to me, I was like, holy shit.
Yeah. Holy shit.
And I went and I'll never forget it. It's like what you would think. It's like you walk into this office on Sunset Boulevard and I walk into the smoky office where there was this, to me, this like it was like being asked, just summoned to the principal's office. And it was
Yeah.
Mustafa with his pipe in his mouth and all the Halloween posters on the wall behind him. And I just sat there almost like frozen in terror. And I think the meeting lasted all of 10 minutes. And I think he was just kind of, maybe he just wanted to meet me because he was like, who's this kid? Like, who, like, I think he was maybe I'm more curious. And we had this very brief interaction and he was very polite, but it was kind of like, thanks for coming in. And I'm like, fuck. And 4 years later, my phone rang. 4 years. And it was his office and they wanted to meet me. And the series for 4 years had gone through all kinds of legal wranglings and there were fights among all the business partners and including John Carpenter, Deborah Hill, and they wanted to make the movie somewhere else. And he had it was a big knot of legal
It was a
mess.
clusterfuck.
It was a clusterfuck.
Yeah.
So that being said, the rights ended up back with Mustafa and he had made a deal to do the film, the six, with this new upstart studio called Miramax, this new kind of like banner they created called Dimension Films
Mm-hmm.
with Bob Weinstein. And I was brought in again, and I pitched what I thought was an idea for the movie, and lo and behold, they hired me to write it. And at that point, I was 24.
Wow. That is that. I mean, at 19, first of all, to be brought in to meet these people for the Halloween
Yeah,
franchise, to write the
right.
screenplay at 24 is almost unbelievable.
I know,
You
I
know?
know, I know. I think I didn't know how young I was. It's a good thing I didn't because I think I would have been like today. never attempt such a thing. I think I was young enough to be naive enough to think that that's how it's done.
Yeah, yeah.
so, so
Now,
it's sometimes it's like what you don't know can't hurt you.
yeah, exactly. Ignorance is bliss. Now, you do have producer credits in the film as well, do you not?
Not on Halloween, but I went on to produce a few films. I produced a movie that was pretty successful called The Haunting in Connecticut.
Oh my God, that's another movie I love.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we that was a long road to get that made, but it turned out great, and I think the movie, it's kind of like a little mini classic in its own genre.
Speaking of that, and you sort of kind of see a pattern with the Amityville and the Haunting in
Hmm.
Connecticut, which is
Hmm.
based on another true story. I've
Right.
seen documentaries with the real family. There is a
Yep.
sequel to A Haunting in Connecticut.
Well, just don't get me started on that one.
Yeah, which takes place in Georgia,
Yeah,
but
right. Yeah,
but
that's a whole talk about a legal mess. But yeah,
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 yeah.
but you see a pattern here where you really like to take now with Ted Bundy. Yeah, it
Hmm.
seems that you really have a passion for telling true stories and trying to stay as faithful and as accurate to the real story as possible.
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, yes. For me, the truth is always more terrifying than fiction. There's no accident that I call the movie American Boogeyman. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a parallel there to Halloween. That
Mm-hmm.
Ted Bundy was arrested, and in early 1978 when they were making the original Halloween.
Wow.
And I do wonder, and I've never asked him this question, but I do wonder if John and Deborah were somehow, maybe even if almost subliminally inspired by Bundy when they created Michael
That's
Myers. That
interesting.
kind of phantom that's roaming around and killing hapless girls. I think there was, that was all on the news at the time. It was all kind of what everybody was talking about. So maybe, I mean, again, I don't think there was any direct connection, but I think maybe we're always kind of informed. Like my work is always informed, and I think most artists would say their work is informed by what we're hearing, what we know, what's in the culture. But these were the stories that really on like a primal level, really terrified me as a kid.
Yeah.
The Manson murders to onward to Ted Bundy, and then these haunted house stories. I mean, I remember the Amityville Horror, the novel, the book, the
Mm-hmm.
Jay Anson book. I remember we were in the schoolyard. We'd be like all gather around at recess and like read another chapter out loud to each other. And then there were flies. So, I mean, these were stories that
And voices
kind of
saying,
all
"Get out."
right,
Yeah.
right. It was just these were the things that kind of informed my childhood, my experience. Maybe kind of probably were haunting the back of my brain somewhere. So to be able to kind of revisit them, and sometimes somewhat it feels like it's cathartic in a way, like you're telling the story in a way that now it's not as scary as it was because you're giving it your own voice. It's your own
Mm-hmm.
perception of that story being put forth. And, some people are offended by it. I think we live in a culture where it's like anything you do, people are going to take a stand. It's like, I'm not comfortable with that, or that's problematic for me. These were real people. I'm like, of course they were real people. Of course they were. And we should remember them.
Mm-hmm.
That we absolutely should remember them. We should remember Sharon Tate. We should remember the victims of Ted Bundy. Those are the names that I hope resonate with people.
Yeah.
I don't glorify Charles Manson. I don't glorify Ted Bundy. I have no anything in my heart but contempt and disgust for what they did.
Yeah.
But people just want to think what they want to think these days.
Exactly. People like to make their own stories up and fill in the blanks with their
Well,
versions.
and they decide like the kind of person you are. They want to ascribe some like sit on some moral soapbox,
Yeah.
thinking that I'm this like deviant,
Mm,
whatever. I'm like, wow, like if they knew me in real life, just what, like I said at the beginning, like what a chicken shit I really am
yeah.
when it comes to these things. And I think, part of what we all do collectively, like maybe it's just something we do as writers or filmmakers or what have you. I think we take those childhood fears and we find an outlet for them somehow. I've never gone out of my way to try to, upset people or defame the families of victims or anything. If anything, I pay tribute to them, in these films and show that they were real people with real lives, with faults, with dreams and ambitions. And again, like in the case of the new movie, that there was a young detective out there who fought for them, who gave them a voice, who tracked down this insidious man and helped to bring him to justice. There were a
Yeah.
lot of people behind that, but yeah, I think those are the things that are important to me. You know, there is dark, but there's also light, and I think that those are things, those contrasts that's what storytelling is all about.
Do you
So, I
credit?
mean, yeah,
I'm sorry. Do you credit Halloween 6 as being the big thing in your career that propelled your career at such a
it
young
gave me a
age?
career. Oh my God. I mean, without that movie, maybe I would have never gotten a chance. I think, it's funny. I met Deborah Hill back in those days, the late Deborah Hill,
Yeah,
who was just very kind to me. And when I was hired to do the movie, even though she wasn't directly involved, she spoke with me at length, and she's like, you know what I think is great about these sequels, even though it's maybe not the way we would approach them, but that it gives new people a chance.
yeah.
It gives everybody, people who have maybe not been discovered yet or had their work shown or been given a job to kind of show their talent. And she goes, that's why I think that the franchise lives on and it should live on. And I hope you do a great job with it so that they can make 7, 8, 9, and of course now they have done all that.
Exactly.
So,
Did you
but
get a chance
yeah,
to meet and talk with John Carpenter at all?
yeah, a couple times.
And
He's always been very, I think until recently, and now he came back, to the fold, and I think Malik Akkad had a big hand in bringing him back in.
yeah,
Um, but John was always very blasé about the sequels. I think he just was like, it's another paycheck for me. I don't care.
well,
Never
the
really.
story goes, he did not. He when he did Halloween in '78, he wanted it to be an anthology
That's
series.
right.
Yeah,
He sure did. Yeah, yeah, and that's a cool idea. I mean, I think Halloween 3 gets a bad rap, but I think it's like that movie was like kind of a victim of bad marketing, bad timing.
you
It's not a
take
bad
away the
movie.
Halloween title, it's a good movie.
Well, even if you just took away the three,
Yeah,
3 connotes a continuation of two. So I think, and the fact that it was just one year after
yeah,
Halloween 2,
hmm
I think we all went in. I mean, I'm speaking from my 13-year-old self here.
yeah,
We all went into that movie thinking, "Oh my God, he didn't burn up in the hospital.
yeah, yeah, and it had
How's
nothing
he
to
going to get
do.
his eyeballs back?" We didn't get that until Halloween 4.
Hmm.
But 3 was really an experiment to try to take the whole thing in a new direction of a series of Halloween based stories that would be told annually. And I think it just didn't work because the timing was bad, the marketing was bad. The movie's not bad though.
No,
It's not a Halloween sequel. And I think that,
that
that's what
disappointed
they
a
did.
lot of
That's what they
people.
didn't. Yeah, that's what they didn't realize at the time, that people just wanted more and more and more and more Michael Myers. And when we did 6, like people were like, "There's going to be 6 of these movies? What the hell?" People couldn't believe that we are going to make another one.
Yeah,
And now look,
and it's just been
and now
going
the
and
series
going.
is now it's bigger than it's ever been, and I think that's.
I think Halloween 2018 just, I don't know, reinvigorated this franchise
It did,
by,
yeah,
Carpenter played a role in it, and they basically, Carpenter said, forget every Halloween after the original. This
right,
is the sequel. How does that make you
yes.
feel?
I don't take any of it personally. I just, it's a different timeline. What I kind of disagree with though is the whole notion of like that she's just not the sister anymore. It's like,
Yeah,
come on, like I feel like when I are trying to like pull the wool over our eyes. I
yeah.
mean, for those of us who've, invested so much of our, devotion to the franchise over the years, and me just speaking as a fan, not as one of the
Hmm.
storytellers, but come on,
Yeah,
she's the sister,
yeah. I mean,
and you didn't need to take that away, because I mean honestly it's the same thing. They did If they had her the sister in the last movie,
yeah,
it wouldn't have changed the story. In fact, it
yeah,
might have made it a little stronger, because now it's about generations.
yeah.
It's about daughter, the granddaughter, and that bid for survival that they all have. I think by taking it out, it actually kind of diminished it,
And that,
because like, well, what's he going there
yeah,
for? What's he
exactly. And when they
whole
took it
point?
out, you as the viewer are left, okay, so if it's not his sister, what the hell did uh Laurie Strode invoke in Michael Myers for
Right.
to be his main person to go after? What was it?
Yeah,
Just
and I
because
mean, and it's
what?
almost
She
like, I
dropped
think,
off the
yeah.
keys at the house? That's it?
Right, right. And I think that's was the randomness. And I understood that's what the first movie was about, but it did develop from there. And we all sat through. I mean, even Jamie Lee came back for H2O. And I mean, it was always, I was his sister and he was my brother and he killed our other sister.
Yeah.
There's these long speeches and scenes where she kind of delves into the mythology of all of it. and to just sort of say that didn't happen is
Yeah.
kind of like a bit of a slap in the face. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No,
Um,
I totally see
I
your
don't think,
point of
I
view.
think that was like kind of, I think that was playing a little unfair with the loyal audience. I mean, I understood in a way the reason to like, well, what if there weren't sequels, and what if it was this? It's a, like Halloween has become like, well, choose your own adventure. You
Yeah.
know,
Which timeline do you choose to
which
follow?
timeline do you
H2O is
choose? So
completely different from, the
right where we left
2018.
off, right,
Yeah.
right. Well, even with six, they that's the first one where they diverted the timeline back
Yeah.
into something. It was like that was like a sequel to two.
Yeah. Yeah.
As opposed to, so they kind of carved four, five, and six out into its own timeline, and even it's just all confusing.
It
So I
is.
think, in a way, for economy, and I think for just to draw the largest audience, so that you're not confusing, like, well, what do I have to go back and watch all these movies? I think they just wanted to kind of consolidate
Yeah, and also,
and make it.
Daniel, in my opinion, the movie that's coming out next year, Halloween
Mhm.
Ends, there's not a single being in my fiber that I believe that's going to be the last Halloween movie.
Oh yeah, that's right. Don't believe
Just
that.
like Friday the
Believe
13th
that.
Part 4, the
That's
final
right. The
chapter.
final chapter. Yeah, the Halloween ends is the final, the Friday the
Yeah,
13th, the
yeah.
final chapter
N-
of the series.
No,
Trust me,
not going to happen.
it's
Daniel,
not
this
ending.
has been fascinating, man. I've loved this hour and
Me
talking to
too.
you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Now, the movie,
Thank you.
guys, is called Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman. It's coming out Friday, September 3rd, to all popular video on demand streaming services, Daniel.
That's right.
That's
And
right.
DVD.
Yep. So check it out. I haven't seen it, but I'm sure it's great. I'm going to be checking it out. So definitely, again, Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman, written, directed, produced by our guest tonight, Daniel Farrands. Daniel, again, thank you so much. I want to thank our audience. Any final thoughts you want to share?
Guys, thank you. No, thank John, thank you, and thanks to everybody who has supported me, and certainly the fans of Halloween that have kind of, again, given me a career that I don't take for granted. And secondly, just everybody take care of each other. It's a crazy time we're living in, and
Yeah.
be good to one another.
You've had a blessed, great career, and it's been an honor.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Just a little scheduling note: our next episode is going to be 1 week from today. We are attending New Jersey Horror Fest this weekend. We'll be bringing to you some good footage. So we'll be back on the air a week from today on Tuesday, the 7th, I believe. So everyone stay safe, take care, and we'll be talking to you soon. And stay walking. Good night.